A girl left her house for a quick walk to the corner store, just a few minutes away, planning to grab a soda and a snack. But she never returned. What should have been an ordinary summer afternoon instantly spiraled into every parent's worst nightmare. Police launched a search, neighbors joined in, and soon the quiet community found itself tangled in a mystery that would remain unsolved for decades. Strange clues surfaced along the way, but none of them brought investigators any closer to the truth, until the real story finally emerged in a way no one could have predicted. Christy Wesselman was born on April 19, 1970, in the peaceful suburb of Glen Ellen, Illinois. She lived with her mother, her two older brothers, and her sister. Their town was known for being one of the safest places in the area, the kind of neighborhood where kids played outside for hours, riding bikes, exploring the streets, or visiting each other's homes without any fear. Christy loved being outdoors. She was friendly, upbeat, and always surrounded by friends. At school, Christy was well-liked and involved in almost everything. She had a bright personality, a wide circle of friends, and even earned the position of vice president of her class. Outside of academics, she played volleyball and softball, and during the warm months she spent most of her free time hanging out with classmates or enjoying summer activities. In July of 1985, 15-year-old Christy was taking summer classes and living a pretty normal teenage routine. On July 21st, she came home from school around 3:30 p.m. Not long after walking through the door, she told her mom she wanted to run to the nearby store to pick up a soda and a chocolate bar for the two of them. It was a short walk, just a few minutes away, so her mom expected her back almost immediately, but as the minutes passed, something didn't feel right. Christy wasn't coming home. At first, her mother assumed she may have bumped into some friends and lost track of time. This was the mid-80s, long before cell phones, so there was no easy way to check in. But as daylight faded, her concern grew. She called Christy's friends. None of them had seen her. Growing worried, she set out toward the store herself, scanning every street and yard along the way. But Christy was nowhere. Christy's family searched for hours, and by 1:50 a.m., with no sign of her anywhere, her mother finally called the police. As officers arrived and began gathering information, hoped the night would bring answers, but instead, it only deepened the mystery. On a warm July afternoon, 15-year-old Christy Wesselman left her home for what should have been a simple, everyday errand. The kind of short walk teenagers in her neighborhood made constantly. The kind nobody ever worried about. Her destination was a small convenience store just minutes away, a place she had visited countless times. But this time, Christy didn't return. And that single walk would set off one of the most heartbreaking and baffling mysteries her quiet Illinois community had ever faced. Christy had grown up in Glen Ellen, a suburban town that people often described as safe, peaceful, and sheltered from the world's darker realities. Born on April 19, 1970, she was the youngest in her family, living with her mother, her sister, and two older brothers. Their neighborhood was the kind of place where kids rode their bikes freely, spent hours at the park, and walked to friends' homes without ever checking in. That freedom was part of childhood in the 1980s, and Christy loved every bit of it. In school, she stood out not because she tried to, but because everyone naturally liked her. Christy was outgoing, friendly, and involved in almost everything. She played volleyball and softball, participated in student activities, and had recently been elected vice president of her class. She had a circle of friends who adored her, and even teachers remembered her as someone who brought energy wherever she went. That summer, even though school was technically out, she was taking extra classes, staying busy, and still managing to spend most evenings hanging out with friends around the neighborhood. July 21st, 1985 started out like any other day. Christy came home from school around 3:30 p.m., dropped off her things, and chatted with her mom for a bit. Nothing at all seemed out of the ordinary. A little while later, she asked her mom if she wanted anything from the local store and offered to grab a soda and a chocolate bar for the both of them. The store was close, so close that her mother expected her back within 10 minutes. She watched Christy head out the front door, unaware that this would be the last time she'd ever see her daughter alive. At first, there was no reason to worry. Teenagers can be unpredictable. Maybe Christy bumped into a friend. Maybe she stopped somewhere along the way. Maybe she simply took her time on the walk back. But as the minutes stretched into an hour and then into several hours, uneasiness slowly turned into fear. By early evening, Christy's mom started calling her daughter's friends. Not one of them had seen her. Nobody even knew she had gone out. With every unanswered call, her mother's anxiety grew heavier. Finally, unable to sit still any longer, she left the house and walked the same path Christy always took to the store. She scanned the sidewalks, yards, and street corners, hoping for any sign of her daughter. But Christy wasn't there. And something in her mother's gut told her this wasn't just teenage wandering. Something was terribly wrong. As the night went on, the worry in the Wesselman home escalated into panic. Christy was responsible, reliable, and always made sure to check in. This was not normal. Her brothers joined the search. Neighbors stepped outside to help. People drove around the area with headlights shining onto empty sidewalks, calling her name. Midnight came and went. And still, no Christy. At 1:50 a.m., her mother could no longer wait. She called the police. Officers arrived quickly and immediately began retracing the girl's last known steps. One of the first places they headed was the small convenience store. There, they spoke with the store clerk, a man who actually knew Christy well. He had lived nearby for years and had even babysat her when she was younger. He confirmed that Christy had come in around 4 p.m., bought 2 chocolate bars, and then headed out the door. She seemed cheerful. Normal. Nothing about her behavior looked off. She didn't appear scared, worried, or in a rush. She didn't mention plans to meet anyone. That was the last confirmed sighting of her. As the hours passed, officers searched wooded trails, parks, abandoned lots, and every nearby street. Dogs were brought in. Flashlights cut through the darkness as search teams combed through brush and ravines. Detectives began knocking on doors and interviewing people who lived along Christy's walking route. Some had seen her earlier that day, but none had seen her after she left the store. The community was in shock. This simply didn't happen in Glen Ellen. Parents who had always allowed their children to roam freely were suddenly keeping them inside. Neighbors who never locked their doors started checking their windows twice. Something evil had slipped into their safe little town, and nobody knew where it went, or if it was still there. By the next morning, dozens of volunteers had joined police in the search. Christy's picture was posted everywhere: store windows, telephone poles, bus stops. Her family went door to door handing out flyers, desperate for someone, anyone, to come forward with information. Even the smallest detail could have made a difference, but no one knew anything. Days passed. Then nearly a week. Every lead turned into a dead end. Every possible sighting amounted to nothing. Rumors spread through the community, but none of them brought investigators closer to finding Christy. Then, on July 28, 7 days after she vanished, a terrible discovery was made. A man walking near St. James Farm, a large forest preserve just a short distance from Christy's home, noticed something unusual near a secluded trail. When he got closer, he realized what he was looking at and immediately called police. Officers rushed to the scene, and within minutes, the area was sealed off. There, in a densely wooded area near the edge of the preserve, they found Christy's body. Her death was brutal, horrifying, and absolutely devastating to everyone who knew her. The serene trails that locals had always used for jogging and biking suddenly felt eerie and unsafe. A quiet suburb had become the center of a nightmare. And for police, the case had just shifted from a missing person search to a murder investigation. But the strangest part, even though investigators collected physical evidence from the scene, including DNA, they still couldn't identify who had attacked Christy, not yet, and that lack of answers would haunt her family and community for nearly 3 decades. The discovery of Christy Wesselman's body shattered the sense of safety Glen Ellen once treasured. In the days that followed, fear spread through the community while investigators worked around the clock to understand what had happened. The crime scene offered clues, some clear, some confusing, but nothing that pointed to a specific suspect. And in a case this devastating, the lack of answers only made the loss more crushing. Detectives examined the area where Christy had been found. Her body was lying near a wooded trail, partially hidden, as if someone had wanted her to stay undiscovered. Those trails were familiar to many residents, including Christy, but they were also secluded enough that a predator could easily take advantage of the quiet. Forensic teams collected fibers, soil samples, and DNA, hoping that science would reveal what witnesses couldn't. But in 1985, DNA testing was still in its early stages, primitive compared to what investigators can do today. They stored it carefully, knowing that one day the technology might catch up, but at that moment, it wasn't enough. With no solid leads, investigators turned to interviews. They talked to anyone who lived near the path Christy usually walked, anyone who might have seen her that day, anyone who seemed out of place in the neighborhood. Hundreds of tips poured in. Some claimed they had seen suspicious vehicles, others reported strange individuals lingering around the nearby woods. But every time detectives chased down a report, it fizzled into nothing. Rumors continued to swirl. Parents whispered about safety. Teachers wondered if someone had been watching Christy. Kids who used to ride their bikes freely now stayed indoors. The murder created a shadow over the community, one that refused to fade. Then came a potential break. A man who lived near the area reported hearing something unusual on the afternoon Christy vanished. He described what he believed sounded like a struggle, maybe even screams, coming from the wooded area. But his account was vague, and without corroboration, it couldn't be confirmed. Days later, another neighbor reported seeing a man jogging near the preserve who seemed out of breath and panicked. But his description was incomplete, and detectives couldn't match it to anyone. Still, investigators kept moving. They honed in on individuals with known criminal histories, especially those with records involving assaults. One man, in particular, drew their attention, someone who had a reputation for making women uncomfortable and had been in the area around the time Christy disappeared. Detectives questioned him, searched his home, and collected forensic samples. But nothing matched. The evidence simply wasn't there, and with each unsuccessful lead, the case grew colder. Months passed. Then years. Christy's family never gave up pushing for answers, but with no new information, the investigation slowly faded from public attention. Detectives retired. Files were boxed up and stored. For a while, it felt like Christy's story was becoming just another unsolved tragedy, one more case that slipped into silence. But behind the scenes, something important was happening. As forensic technology advanced through the 1990s and early 2000s, DNA testing became increasingly sophisticated. Law enforcement agencies across the country began re-examining old cases, testing samples that had been stored away for decades. And eventually, someone looking at Christy's file realized the evidence collected in 1985, DNA taken from the crime scene, had never been tested with modern tools. In 2011, the DuPage County Sheriff's Office made a decision that would change everything. They reopened Christy's case and submitted the old samples for advanced DNA testing. Detectives waited anxiously. It had been 26 years. Could this finally be the moment they found something? A week passed. Then another. And then, quietly, without fanfare, the results came in. The DNA matched a man named Michael Jones. Jones was no stranger to the criminal justice system. He had a history of violent offenses and had been incarcerated multiple times. In fact, at the time of the new DNA match, he was already serving a prison sentence for unrelated charges. This revelation stunned investigators. Michael Jones had lived in the area back in 1985. He had access to the same wooded trails. He lived close enough to Christy's route that he could have seen her walking that day. And most importantly, the DNA recovered from the scene was his. It was undeniable. With this breakthrough, a cold case that had tormented a family for decades suddenly shifted into motion. Detectives immediately traveled to interview Jones in prison. At first, he denied everything, refusing to acknowledge any involvement in Christy's death. But the DNA evidence left no room for doubt. It placed him at the crime scene. And investigators believed it placed him with Christy in the final moments of her life. The DuPage County State's attorney began preparing for prosecution. Finally, after 27 years, Christy was getting her moment in court. When news of the arrest broke, the community was stunned. Some people remembered Jones from years before, others were shaken by how someone so dangerous had been living so close. For Christy's family, the development brought a complicated mix of relief and heartbreak. They had prayed for answers, and now they finally had them, but it couldn't bring Christy back. During the trial, prosecutors laid out the evidence. They walked the jury through the timeline of Christy's last day. They presented the DNA findings, the forensic analysis, and the composite understanding of what happened on that wooded trail. Witnesses testified about Jones's violent history, his presence in the area, and his behavior during the time of the crime. The weight of the evidence was overwhelming. Michael Jones chose not to testify. But the silence didn't help him. After hearing everything, the jury took little time to reach a decision. They found him guilty of Christy Wesselman's rape and murder. In 2015, 30 years after Christy's life was taken, Michael Jones was sentenced to 80 years in prison. For Christy's family, the verdict brought long-awaited justice. Her mother, who had carried the weight of her daughter's loss for decades, finally had an answer to the question that had haunted her since that summer day in 1985. Who did this? Though the pain would never disappear, knowing the truth allowed the family to breathe again, even if only a little. The community, too, felt a sense of closure. The case that once shattered their sense of safety had finally come full circle. The DNA that sat in an evidence locker for years had ultimately solved the case. And Christy's story, one that almost slipped into darkness, was once again remembered. Christy Wesselman's legacy lives on not just in the justice her family fought for, but in the reminder that even decades later, the truth can still rise to the surface.